The Falcons defense might have cost Matt Stafford the MVP on Monday night, but is their success underneath the bright lights enough to justify retaining the current coaching staff?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network on the planet, which means it's number one in the galaxy. And of course, today's Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app and create an account and use code Locked On NFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Now, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong, entering year 10 here as the humble host of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's episode of this daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we will be looking at the Falcons defense, right? This is not a true blue all 22 review, but I did get a chance to watch the film of the Falcons defense on Tuesday morning from the Monday night game in their win over the Rams. And we'll get sort of into the effectiveness of my charting that defense and their effectiveness utilizing the blitz. We'll talk about AJ Terrell's coverage ability. We'll talk about, CJ Henderson and has he locked down that CB2 spot. We'll talk about the run defense's turnaround since that Colts game and who's been behind that. But we'll start things off talking about, is this Falcons defensive success, and particularly that of Jeff Ulbrich and the success he's had, a reason to justify retaining this coaching staff? Because, Tuesday, or I think she sent this out Monday night, but I saw Amina Kimes tweet Monday night talking about how, Matt Stafford, Drake Maye, and Josh Allen all struggled against this defense. Those are 3 of the top 4 MVP candidates, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, that have struggled, relatively speaking, against this Falcons defense. Drake Maye has now become the front runner over at FanDuel to win the MVP, thanks to Stafford's 3-interception performance against this Falcons defense this past Monday. Essentially, it's probably going to wind up costing Stafford the MVP race, but we'll see how the voters wind up voting in the end. Saying Drake Maye struggled against his defense is probably a little bit of a stretch because he did absolutely carve up the Falcons defense in the first half of the game, but there were certainly some struggles in the second half of the game that allowed the Falcons to come back in that game. But that was a game where we saw the Falcons blitz being particularly effective against Drake Maye and the Patriots. We know that was a big part of their success against Josh Allen and the Bills, and it was also something that the Falcons found some success early on in this Rams game. We'll break more of that down later in today's episode. But it's just funny to me because, talking about this defensive turnaround and their success, it continues to bring up more and more parallels that we have with that 2019 season, where one of the compelling reasons to retain that coaching staff back then was due to the defensive turnaround we saw that year as part of maintaining defensive continuity with the Dan Quinn-led Falcons back then. For those of you that don't recall, the Falcons started that season 1-7, in part thanks to very poor defensive play, with Dan Quinn calling the defense early in that season and then making the switch to Raheem Morris and Jeff Ulbrich after a while and taking over play calling in the second half. And the Falcons wound up winning 6 of their last 8 games in that 2019 season, right? It wasn't just the defense in the first half struggles because, shout out to Dirk Cutter. The offense was very underwhelming in most of those games as well. But, the narrative I remember back after that 2019 season was sort of how, Raheem Morris being this young coach and, being a player's coach and whatnot, just has a special connection with some of the young players. And that's one of the reasons why this defense turned around. But if you listen to the Locked On Falcons podcast, and 2019 was the first year we started charting the defense, the thing that we pointed out was, I don't know if it's really, some special ability of Raheem Morris as a defensive play caller or anything like that. but it's mostly the Falcons kind of feasted on some bad quarterbacks in the second half of the season. Jameis Winston, Kyle Allen in 4 games where the Falcons were like plus 10 across those 4 games against Carolina and Tampa Bay, against those 2 quarterbacks in terms of turnover margin. And then you also had a very strong defensive performance against a rookie in Gardner Minshew. And while the Falcons did have 2 really good defensive performances against Drew Brees, as well as the 49ers in that game, in that second half of the season, it was for the most part, the Falcons kind of feasting on some bad quarterbacks. And, when we talk about one of the reasons that could be used to justify retaining Raheem Morris after this season, which is going to be the ongoing debate and discussion until we get to, Black Monday on January 5th, 2026, is going to be, retaining this defense of coaching staff and Jeff Ulbrich kind of single-handedly saving Raheem Morris's job. And I believe Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta, mentioned that on last night's, post-game Falcon squad show that he and I did. Now, you're not going to hear me say that, right? And it's not because Jeff Ulbrich doesn't deserve a ton of credit for the success that this defense has had, as we've mentioned a number of times over the last 2 months here on this podcast. He deserves a lot of the credit, if not the vast majority of the credit, for this defensive improvement this year. But for me, like, I wouldn't use Jeff Ulbrich as a selling point for why, if you're going to try to justify retaining this regime, I wouldn't use Jeff Ulbrich for that. And to, the current Falcons defensive credit, they're not really preying on bad quarterbacks like they were in the second half of 2019. Obviously, with their success against Stafford last night, as well as others top-end quarterbacks that they've had success against this year, like Josh Allen and relatively speaking, Drake Maye. They've performed really well against some of the league's best quarterbacks is basically what we're getting at. But it's still similar, even though it's different, right, in terms of those 2019, 2025 parallels, because, partially the reason, this defense has exceeded expectations, but we've discussed several times there's potential for regression in 2026. We won't get into all the reasons for that, but a lot of it is, a big part of their ability to win with 4 has been guys like Arnold Ebiketie and Leonard Floyd, who are free agents. Big part of their ability to win with their blitz and rushing with 5 has been Kay Nellis, who's also a free agent. And certainly if those guys aren't retained, there's potential for some regression from this pass rush, particularly. And while the expectation is going to be that, guys like young players like James Pierce and Walker and others will step up and fill the void, left by these players, it's certainly, possible that they could do that. But we've been down this road before with the Atlanta Falcons and young guys being expected to kind of step up and fill the role of more established veterans in terms of production as far as pass rush goes. And of course, the mantra is going to be, well, this time it's going to be different when those previous instances didn't quite work out in the Falcons' favor, like 2028 and 2024. But as we know, there is obviously inherent risk involved with that because of those previous, circumstances. And so to me, my personal opinion is, like, I don't think Jeff Ulbrich's, success this year should be a significant factor in, Arthur Blank evaluating whether or not he should keep this coaching staff. While I do believe that the Falcons have a young up and coming defense, they have some very talented young players that I'm looking forward to seeing how they grow over the coming years. It's not that excitement for me and what this defense can be is not based off of what I expect them to be in 2026. It's really based off of what I think this defense can grow into with more time in 27 and 28 as they continue to invest more significant draft resources in that side of the ball. To me, given the effort or, i.e. money that the Falcons are going to need to invest this offseason in order to just kind of maintain the status quo for this defense, to me is not really worth it personally. Now, obviously your mileage may vary on that front, but, I think while this defense is, really shown to be very capable in some big games this year against some high-level quarterbacks, I've also watched this defense kind of struggle against some low-level mid-tier quarterbacks like Bryce Young and Tua Tagovailoa, Daniel Jones and Tyrod Taylor, among others. And, not to throw shade at Mina or any of the other national folks that, are going to hype up how good this defense is, but it's very easy to get excited about the potential of this defense and buy into the hype if you're only really watching the Falcons in these primetime outings, with the vast majority of people that cover the league as a whole aren't really grinding, 1 o'clock games for the Falcons on a weekly basis, right? And so they've generally been excellent in these primetime games, but they've also really struggled in these Sunday 1 o'clock games that no one is really paying attention to, outside of, people like myself that are contractually obligated to be forced to watch this team. And not just talking about the defense, you just look at the team's overall success in the big moments, right? This year they're 4-1 in primetime games. They're 7-3 overall under Raheem Morris in primetime games. And so if we assume that the Falcons, or if we assume that the Bucs wind up winning the division, they're currently favored according to FanDuel for this Week 18 game against Carolina, that would put them at 5-3 across these two seasons in primetime games against playoff teams, right? But then when you contrast that to what the Falcons are at 1 o'clock on a Sunday, a typical game, they're 1-7 this year in 1 p.m. Sunday games, right? 5-13 overall under Raheem Morris over the last 2 years in 1 p.m. Sunday games, right? They're 1-5 against playoff games combined if the Bucs wind up winning the division in 1 p.m. Sunday games across the two seasons. Or if it's Carolina that winds up winning the division, right? Then they will be 1-7 against playoff teams at 1 p.m. on a Sunday. And so basically what I'm sitting here going is like, it's very easy to get duped. It was something that we talked about yesterday on the podcast in the post game, where it's like human nature, because humans are flawed, we can get duped by seeing how well this team performs under the bright lights and convincing ourselves, oh, the Falcons are actually a good team. Right? That's been the narrative. You've heard it from multiple people that cover this league. It's like, how are the Falcons only 6-9? Well, the reason is they stink when they're not in primetime, right? When you're not paying attention, the minute you turn your back and start focusing on the other teams, they wind up being a bad team. And that has kind of been the story of the Falcons the last 8 years, where it's very easy to look at their 6 or 7 wins, right, that they typically are been getting, and in seeing their 6-11, 7-10 type record, and convincing yourself, as we've stated many times, that no, they're actually a 10-7 or 11-6 team. They're closer to that because of that sort of selective bias that we as flawed human beings have when it comes to this thing. And the hope is that the Falcons will learn from this mistake and not fall into this trap once more of convincing themselves that they're secretly a better team than what the proof in the pudding on the football field actually is. But we'll see it on that front. But this was another game, as I mentioned earlier, that the Falcons blitz proved to be an effective X factor for them early on. And we'll break down how that was the case, as well as give AJ Terrell some love for his performance on the back end as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. It is playoff time coming up in the NFL, but it's already playoff time in college football. And there's nothing like being at a playoff game, whether it's the crowd noise, energy, or cheering alongside other fans. And, watching at home can be great, but being in the stadium is just different, right? And the frustrating part when it comes to trying to get into the stadium with getting tickets is waiting in queues, dealing with logins, and watching prices change right at checkout. And that's why Game Time is going to give the advantage back to the fans. It's the hack for unlocking amazing tickets and experiences in just a few taps. You can pull up the Game Time app and check out the prices for the upcoming Peach Bowl next week. The app is intuitive, so finding the right tickets in your price range is easy. And we love the panoramic seat views, and the fees are all included up front, so you don't have to worry for surprises at checkout or when you arrive to the stadium. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDON NFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time app today and get back to being there live. So before we continue today's episode, I want to thank you once again for those of you that are everydayers that make Locked On Falcons your first listen. You are the reason why Locked On is now the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy, but you can level up your everydayerness by joining the Everydayer Club, and you'll get some exclusive perks like ad-free version of the podcast, Locked On merch, but you also will get, access to a Locked On Podcast Network Discord server exclusive. So if you want to get in there and talk trash to some Saints fans next week after the Falcons potentially win the game, or you just want to talk trash regardless of what happens next week, we all kind of know what could happen next week. Becoming an everydayer, member of the Everydayer Club is thing for you. It's $5 a month, $50 a year, and you can join at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com, and you can find out some of the other perks that you can get there at that link in the description below. So, as I mentioned earlier, the blitz was effective early on in this game. The Rams had a 29% success rate based off my charting when the Falcons blitzed in the first half. The Falcons did wind up blitzing on about 39% of the Rams dropbacks in the first half, which is a high rate, right? Typically in the NFL, it's somewhere in the 20s, right? Both of the Rams interceptions in the first half came when the Falcons blitz. Now, it's hard to say that either one of those plays was exclusively effective by the blitz. Like Stafford missed that first interception on the pick six to Jesse Bates, where he tried to make a no-look pass to Kanata Mumfield and overthrew that pass, and Bates picked it off, and then tried to go deep against Caden Ellis on Xavier Smith, and then Xavier Watts made a great play on that particular play. Now, after the first half, the Falcons, with their 21-point lead, kind of just relied on the four-man rush in the second half, right? They only blitzed 2 times based off my charting. So only 9% of the Rams dropbacks in the second half overall. Both times they blitzed, the Rams did generate explosives off of that blitz, that 4th and 6th conversion to Xavier Smith for 36 yards in the third quarter that helped set up that first score. And then there was a 21-yard check down, I believe, to Kyron Williams on a blown coverage where essentially K-Now splits on the play. And if, the Falcons had just been played in coverage, that would have been his area of the field. The Kyron Williams sort of settled into that spot, and no one was there to cover him for that 20-plus yard gain. So, this game overall to me was an instance, going back to what we talked about post-game, was it did feel like the Falcons were aggressive early on and then got conservative, as the game wore on, playing with that lead and this relying on their four-man rush and playing coverage. The four-man rush wasn't that effective at slowing down this Rams offense throughout the game, but the coverage was, right? And especially that's thanks to the plays of the safeties making, those plays on the ball for those 3 interceptions, and of course AJ Terrell. And we want to give AJ Terrell some love here on the podcast because he's been much maligned by certain sectors of the fan base over the last couple of weeks because of some down performances against Seattle in the second half of that game, and Tampa Bay among others. And AJ was lights out in this game, right? Based off my charting on the 10 times he was targeted in this game, he forced an incompletion on 4 of those plays. So about 40%. Generally, anything above 15% is good in terms of a forced incompletion rate. And basically, what is a forced incompletion for me? It's basically anytime when I'm charting it where it's like the quarterback didn't mess up, or the wide receiver didn't mess up, or another defensive player made a play on a play, and it's really just kind of the tight coverage. And AJ has by far been the Falcons' best coverage guy when it comes to forcing those incompletions with that tight coverage, and you saw it throughout the night. 3 of those 4 forced incompletions in this game came against Puka Nacua in the second half. You saw the other one against Kanata Mumfield in the first half, where he got a lot of work against them. And so it was just tight coverage. He had the clamps on Puka Nacua and Mumfield throughout the night. AJ did. And deserves some love here because he just doesn't, I don't think, gets enough love for how good a cornerback he is. Again, he is a classic example of the 5-7-9 phenomenon that you've heard me talk about before on the podcast, where, a 5 out of 10 player, in my opinion, gets overrated and talked about like a 7 out of 10 player. And then when you have like legit 7 out of 10 players, which AJ Terrell is for the most part, and on days like he was on Monday night, is like an 8 or a 9 out of 10 player, but probably on average is a 7 out of 10 player. All people do is complain about, well, he's not really a 9 out of 10 player, right? He's not consistently, the best cornerback in the NFL or top 5 cornerback in the NFL. And it's like, okay, if he's the 12th best cornerback in the NFL, like, I ain't complaining about that on any given Sunday. I will happily take that when you compare it to what the Falcons are getting elsewhere on the football field. So he is a great example of that. And I always like to give AJ some love just because it's like, a handful of games he'll have a rough outing and people are like, well, he stinks and he's overrated and he's overpaid. And it's like, my guys, like the amount of bad games that AJ Terrell has, other players wish they had that many number of good games per season. Now, we'll leave that aside. Reviewing the film, CJ Henderson, we talked about it in the post game. We were praising of CJ Henderson in addition to AJ Terrell. Watching the film back, Henderson was not as impressive as I initially thought, right? Officially, based off my charting, he was targeted 2 times, gave up receptions on both plays for 29 yards, including the 11-yard screen touchdown to Puka Nacua in the second half. And then there were 2 other times he was targeted that were nullified by penalties by DJ Williams. Shout out to DJ Humphreys, I'm sorry. And both times he gave up completions on those 2 targets. Both of those were to Nacua, which was for a combined 76 yards, including a 41-yard touchdown where he got beat deep against quarters. And similar to how we've seen Mike Hughes get beat a number of times deep against quarters in this season. And so reviewing the film, it's like, I do like CJ Henderson more than I like Mike Hughes. I feel like he's played better over the last couple of games than Mike Hughes had played over the previous games. But, I'm not willing, as much as I was willing to say in the post-game show, that maybe the Falcons have found their new CB2 in CJ Henderson after reviewing the film. It's like, it's still a work in progress, not to mention he missed like 3 tackles in this game as well. So quarterback still is an area of concern for this Falcons team. But one area of concern earlier this season was the Falcons run defense. And, while cornerback is a work in progress, the Falcons run defense has been working and progressing. You see what I did there, right? Over the last 7 games. And we'll break down sort of who are the players that are kind of responsible for that recent run defensive turnaround over the last 2 months since that disastrous Colts game as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Have your health or family needs changed lately? Well, Georgia's got you covered. Georgia Access is our state's marketplace for Georgians to compare, apply, and enroll in health insurance plans that offer the best value for their individual needs. Open enrollment is happening right now through January 15th, 2026. So visit georgiaaccess.gov today. Georgia Access, health insurance for Georgia by Georgia. So as we mentioned on the post-game show, the Rams did have more success running the ball in the second half, and we sort of owed some of that to, the scoreboard being a little bit more even, so the Rams could be a little bit more committed to running the football than they were early in the game when they got behind. And some of that may be owed to, Brandon Dolis exiting the game in the second half, right? That you sort of charting it. The Rams were, I believe, successful in like 7 of their 9 runs after Dolis exited the game. And prior to his exit, they were only successful in like 3 out of their 11 runs up to that point. Now, not all of that is due to Dolis, and we'll talk a little bit more about the other people. But I do think Dolis is worth highlighting for. I thought he had one of his better run defensive games he's had this season, going up against backup Rams guard Justin Dedich. And so, we haven't really talked much about the Falcons run defense really since that Colts game, because they gave up over 300 rushing yards in that game. And, that was the culmination of, basically 2 months of terrible run defense. And it was just kind of like, oh yeah, this run defense is terrible and they stink. But they've actually been pretty solid since that game, right? If you begin your, look at the data starting in that following week against Carolina in week 11 and look at, the 7 games now that have been played since then, and look at where this Falcons run defense ranks overall across the league. If you look at it in terms of expected points added or EPA, they're 12th in the NFL since week 11, when they were 28th going in through the Colts game. They're 16th in success rate allowed when they were 29th before. They're 12th in yards allowed when they were 27th before. They're now 13th in yards per carried allowed when they were 27th before, and even yards before contact per carry, They're ninth, in that metric since week 11 when they were 26 in that metric. So, we talk a lot about some of the things that have been better for this football team in the second half, like the play action passing attack, right? And the run defense is one of those areas that went from essentially a bottom 6 unit in the first 9 games of the season that is now a top 12-ish unit over the last 7 games. And to me, the big catalyst for that I've noticed looking at some of the data has been the presences and performances of guys like Kentavius Street and LaCale London. That looking at true media, when those two guys are on the field at the same time, which has been the case for about 40 run plays over the last 7 games, the Falcons have only allowed 95 rushing yards on 40 carries for 2.4 yards per carry, right? Their EPA per play on those 40 plays would be 7th best. Their success rate allowed on those 40 plays would make them the best run defense in the NFL. And then if you just look at their rushing success rate allowed on first downs with those two guys on the field, Street and London, that is, it's about 23% allowed. And the best run defense in the NFL on first downs this year in terms of success rate is the Cleveland Browns, which is allowing a 32% success rate on first downs. And so, in case you're thinking, well, is that just a quirk of, just the overall defense being better over the last, 7 games, when both Street and London are on the sideline and you look at the Falcons run defense, they're allowing 6.2 yards per carry, right? Their EPA per play would be the 30th ranked run defense, and their success rate allowed would be by far the worst run defense in the NFL. And now, obviously, Kentavius Street was inactive against the Rams. The Falcons did play Elijah Garcia in favor of Kentavius Street, and the run defense was still, for the most part, solid in this game. Again, probably a lot of that had to do with LaCale London, who made a number of positive run plays in that. So Dorless was part of that. London, I probably was a bigger part of that, because part of the reason why the run defense got worse in the second half was also the Falcons were playing London less in the second half in some of those situations where the Rams were running the football, because the Falcons wanted to get their pass rushers or more effective pass rushers on the football field. So wanted to give the run defense some love here, because we haven't really talked about it in like 7-8 weeks here on the podcast. Really since that Patriots game, I think, was the last time we had the Colts game and the Patriots game were the last times that we really had a serious conversation about the run defense. And we also wanted to give, LaCale London some love, right? My man's been out here balling this season, which is funny, because he was one of those players. I'm like, the Falcons are really betting on LaCale London being a difference maker in the run defense this year at that nose tackle position, as we talked about throughout the offseason. Hey, the Falcons have a big need for nose tackle. And for, 9 games, it was like, yeah, man, this looked like a terrible decision that the Falcons ignored that nose tackle need this offseason. But, now it's seemingly looking a little bit better based off of how those guys have played over the last 2 months. So shout out to LaCale London for being a big part of that defensive turnaround. And, Kentavius Street, we're going to get another year of Kentavius Street based off of how he's played this year. And I know there's like a handful of you guys that are like, I can't believe the Falcons cut Taquan Graham. And it's like, we don't need Taquan Graham. We got Kentavius Street, baby. So, Dorless, hopefully we'll get some good news on Dorless, but the lack of an update today is not a promising sign, or at least I didn't see an update today on Tuesday. So hopefully we'll have something more tangible in the future. If I haven't sat down and really watched the offensive yet, and if there to me is something truly compelling that deserves a full episode breakdown, we might do that tomorrow. But if not, then our next show is going to be the crossover Thursday show with Locked On Saints host Ross Jackson tomorrow. So we'll see. But yeah, I foresee when we do the extended all 22 review this week, we will get into the offense and talk a lot about Bijan and break down some of his film for the Locked On Falcons Insiders. You can become a Locked On Falcons Insider and get access to that film analysis at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. But right now, I don't foresee really taking a deep look, because it's just basically Bijan. I don't know if that is deserving of a full episode of a podcast, right? We'll get into that film breakdown. So as I sit here today, I don't know. this might be our all 22 review episode for the week. So if we do wind up doing extended all 22 review, we'll look a lot at these things that we're talking about on defense, as well as Bijan's incredible performance in this game. And we'll see. So we'll play that by ear, guys, if I need to feel compelled to do a sixth episode this week. But if we do, that will be out for you before the crossover Thursday. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss that episode. And, of course, check out Locked On NFL for your second listen to get the scoop on all the latest, what's going on with Trayvon Diggs in Dallas. Locked On Cowboys, Locked On NFL will have you covered in that front. And, that's it. And, of course, make sure you check out the Everydayer Club. If you haven't already, $5 a month, $50 a year. To go talk trash to Saints fans. Again, that's the most compelling reason to to join the Everyday Club. But there's other reasons like ad-free version, merch store, as well as talking trash or to other fans in the Locked On exclusive Discord channel. So go check it out at the link in the description at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. That's going to do it for us, guys. Appreciate it. Until then, it's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.